He then took her hands and gently placed them on his chest before beginning to kiss her once again. She glanced up at him with her lips quivering as she sought for an explanation, and the truth was apparent. Isabella attempted to unzip his trousers as they were so engrossed in the moment that they forgot everything about their relationship. He responded by reaching for her hand and brushing her fingers, sending a spark through her that she couldn't ignore. Isabella, a stepmother, often found herself enveloped in solitude. Her husband Alexander was a driven entrepreneur fully consumed by his work. While she admired his ambition, she longed for simple gestures of affection, something as small as a touch or a sign that he noticed her. Over time, their marriage had settled into a predictable rhythm devoid of excitement. Isabella's days blended together in their vast home with the silence and her own thoughts as her only companions that changed when her stepson Samuel moved back in at 25. Samuel exuded vitality and a self-assuredness that seemed to light up every room he entered. He had recently returned from going to school in another country, bringing with him an air of sophistication and charm. Isabella couldn't help but notice how his laughter seemed to breathe life into the house, filling spaces that were previously quiet. Make sure that you subscribe to my channel so that I can continue to bring you more intriguing real tales like this one. Additionally, make sure that you watch this video all the way through and give it a like because this story is going to be quite entertaining. One evening after taking a shower, Isabella stood before the mirror drying her hair. She reached behind her to unclasp her bra, letting it slip off her shoulders before tossing it onto the bed. For a moment she looked at herself in the mirror, her bare chest rising and falling with a soft sigh. Dressed only in her bottom, she felt exposed yet free in the privacy of her room. Suddenly the door creaked open and Isabella turned quickly. Instinctively covering herself, Samuel, she gasped, his face flushed crimson as he quickly looked away, though his gaze lingered a fraction longer than was appropriate. "I'm sorry, I thought you were downstairs," he apologized, his voice full of embarrassment. Her heart raced, a mix of embarrassment and something deeper. Despite the fact that her voice was quieter than she had meant, she was unable to correctly identify you and added, "You need to knock." Samuel murmured, "I'm sorry," and then added, "I'll go." However, he did not walk. Rather, his eyes returned to hers, and his face was split between remorse and something more. "It's Samuel." Isabella resumed, her tone with a more friendly request. "It's fine, just close the door." He complied with her request, closing the door behind him, but he was hesitant to go. The words, "I didn't mean to walk in on you," were said in a low voice by him with his eyes set on the ground. However, he continued, "I can't stop thinking about you." Isabella paused and inquired in a hushed voice, "What do you mean?" "I've always admired you, Isabella," he admitted, "but now that I'm back, it's more than that. I see you, and I can't look away from you." Samuel made a step forward in his confidence, and he returned it. There was a knot in Isabella's throat, and the air between them was dense with feelings that were not being spoken. Before she could speak, he was standing in front of her, his hand stroking her arm, sending a shiver down her spine. She did not draw away from him but instead met his eyes. "Samuel, this is wrong," she muttered when he stopped her. "Then why does it feel so right?" Her own resolve crumbling. "You're young, you don't understand what you're saying," she murmured, though her words lacked certainty. "I know precisely what I'm saying," he answered. "You need to feel wanted and loved." He said words that dissolved her barriers, and when he moved in, she did not stop him. Their lips met in a tentative kiss, one that intensified as desire took control. Samuel's hands rested on her waist, and his touch was solid yet delicate, as if he was scared to break the spell. Isabella allowed herself to become lost in the kiss. As she wrapped her arms around his neck for the first time in years, she had a sense of being loved, alive, and treasured. When they finally drew apart, their breath was ragged. Isabella spoke, her voice trembling. "Samuel," she whispered, "we shouldn't be doing this," he softly replied, "but we already have." His forehead rested in against hers. Isabella closed her eyes, torn between her heart's desire and the voice of reason, but as Samuel gently cued her cheek, she knew this moment would change everything. She stepped back, her arms instinctively crossing over her chest as the weight of what had just happened sank in her heart, hammered in her chest, and the sound drowned out all her thoughts. Samuel remained there, his breathing irregular, his eyes unwavering. "We can't," she said once again, despite the fact that neither of them was convinced by the words. "This isn't right." As he came closer to Isabella, Samuel spoke to her in a tone that was sweet but forceful. He told her, "Sophia, you didn't feel anything between us." He then took her hands and gently placed them on his chest before beginning to kiss her once again. She glanced up at him with her lips quivering as she sought for an explanation, and the truth was apparent. Isabella attempted to unzip his trousers as they were so engrossed in the moment that they forgot everything about their relationship. He responded by reaching for her hand and brushing her fingers, sending a spark through her that she couldn't ignore. "Samuel, it's complicated," she mumbled. "It doesn't have to be," he answered. "The regulations regarding what anybody thinks about me are irrelevant to me since I care about you," Isabella said as she took her hand away from her. With her arms crossed firmly over her chest, she was expressing that she did not get what you were saying. "This is a hazardous situation. Samuel, for the sake of both of us, let it be risky," he pleaded with a sense of urgency in his voice. "I've never felt this way before, Isabella. I can't simply pretend it doesn't exist." Her resolve shook under the intensity of his words and the warmth of his look. She turned away, trying to settle her beating heart. "You need to leave," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "Please, Samuel." Samuel hesitated for a moment, his jaw tightening, debating whether to push further. Finally, he nodded, though the pain in his eyes was unmistakable. "All right," he said softly, moving toward the door. Before leaving, he glanced back at her, his eyes full of longing. "But this isn't over, Isabella. The first no, you feel it too." The door clicked shut, leaving Isabella alone, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions and desire. She sank onto the edge of her bed, burying her face in her hands. What had she done? The next few days passed in a haze of avoidance. Isabella buried herself in chores and errands, looking for any reason to keep herself occupied and away from Samuel. However, despite her best efforts, she was unable to shake the recollection of his touch, his words, and the flame that they had ignited between them. Samuel, on the other hand, was not the kind of person to be ignored. Late one evening, while Isabella was standing in the kitchen washing dishes, she heard his footsteps behind her. "I can't keep pretending everything's normal," he said, his voice calm but full with emotion. Isabella set the dish down and turned to face him. "Samuel, we agreed." "No," he interrupted, stepping closer. "You agreed." "I never did." "Please don't make this harder than it already is," she begged, her voice trembling. "I'm not trying to make it harder," he said, his tone softening. "I'm trying to make it real." Before she could protest, he closed the gap between them, his hands gently cupping her face, his lips brushed against hers, tentative but seeking permission. This time Isabella didn't resist. She leaned in, her hands gripping his arms as the floodgates finally opened, the kiss deep and filled with all the unspoken emotions that had been building. Samuel's hands moved to her waist, pulling her closer. For the first time in years, Isabella felt truly desired when they pulled apart, their foreheads touched, breaths ragged and hearts racing. "We'll figure this out," Samuel whispered, his voice filled with determination. Together, Isabella closed her eyes, her heart torn, but unable to deny the pull she felt toward him. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something more, something forbidden but impossible to resist. The following days became a careful dance despite Isabella's initial resistance. The wall she had built around her heart began to crumble one quiet evening as the house settled into a peaceful lull. Each exchange between Isabella and Samuel was filled with tension, and neither of them could ignore it. They exchanged fleeting glances in the kitchen, subtle brushing of fingers when passing each other in the hall, and they exchanged fleeting glances in the kitchen. Samuel found Isabella sitting alone on the porch swing. The warm summer air surrounded them, the distant chirp of crickets providing the only sound. She looked up as he approached, her face illuminated by the soft porch light. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low so as not to disturb the peaceful night. She shook her head, patting the seat next to her. "Too much on my mind." Samuel sat down, the swing creaking beneath them. For a moment they sat in silence, the tension between them palpable. "I've been thinking about you," he admitted, finally breaking the quiet. Isabella turned to him, her lips parting in surprise. "Samuel," he interrupted gently, his eyes locking with hers, "let me say this, you're all I think about, Isabella. You've taken over every part of my mind, and I can't keep pretending that I don't feel what I feel." Her breath caught, and she looked away, focusing on the dark horizon. "It's not that simple," she whispered it as he insisted, his voice gaining strength. "We feel something for each other, something real. Why fight it?" After turning her attention back to him, Isabella's eyes were filled with a mixture of yearning and terror. "Since the situation was not only about us, there were repercussions. It is impossible for anyone to comprehend." Samuel reached out for her hand, his thumb lightly brushing across her knuckles as he did so. "I don't care what other people say. The only thing that matters to me is you." His words shattered something within of her. The control that she had held to for such a long time dissipated, and she rushed forward, her lips catching his in a kiss that was both urgent and gentle. Immediately, Samuel replied by placing his hand on the back of her neck in an effort to intensify the kiss. The connection between them was electrifying. a combination of repressed desire and unrestrained emotion. Time seemed to stand still as they lost themselves in each other. The rest of the world seemed to fade into insignificance when they finally pulled apart, their foreheads resting together and their breaths mingling in the warm night air. At that moment, the swing rocked slightly as Samuel pulled her closer to him. His other hand was resting on her waist. When Isabella opened her eyes, her pulse was hammering as she glanced at him. "This is going to change everything," she mumbled. "Good idea. I don't want to go back to pretending," Samuel replied with a gentle grin. "I don't want to go back to." Isabella let out a shaky laugh, her emotions a whirlwind of joy and uncertainty. "We're going to have to figure this out, we will," he promised, his hands still holding hers together. The night stretched on, but for the first time Isabella felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, their love could survive the challenges ahead. As the weeks turned into months, Isabella and Samuel found themselves navigating an increasingly complex web of emotions and secrets. Despite the fact that their desire was burning brightly, the weight of the implications that their relationship had cast a cloud over their enjoyment. Isabella made a choice one evening after a particularly intense chat. When they were sitting together in her bedroom, she clasped Samuel's hands in hers, and her eyes glistened with tears that had not yet been shed. "We can't keep doing this, Samuel," she said. She said softly, her voice trembling. Samuel's face fell, the hope that had sustained him flickering like a dying candle. "Why, I thought we were building something real." "We were," she whispered, squeezing his hands tightly. "And it was beautiful, but it can't last. The world won't let it." She took a shaky breath, her voice breaking. "I love you, Samuel. That's why I have to let you go." He shook his head, his own eyes misting. "No, we can find a way. We can leave, start fresh. Somewhere else. I'll give you everything. You deserve more than a relationship that is founded on secret and dread. You deserve a life in which you do not have to look over your shoulder. You deserve a life in which you do not have to doubt if what we have is good or wrong. Isabella, please don't walk away from this." Her heart broke at his request, but she knew what she had to do. By cueing her face with his thumbs and wiping away her tears, Samuel informed her that "you are the only thing that feels right without you, and that nothing else mattered." Isabella leaned into his touch, memorizing the feel of his hands on her skin, the way his love made her feel alive. But as much as she wanted to stay, she knew their story had reached its end. They shared one last lingering kiss, pouring every ounce of their love and longing into that moment when they finally pulled apart. They rested their foreheads together, both unwilling to let go just yet. "I'll never forget you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "You'll always be in my heart," he replied, his own voice thick with emotion. With that, Isabella stepped back. The distance between them felt like a chasm. Samuel watched as she turned and went away, her shadow receding and disappearing down the corridor. He did not stop her because he knew that this was her method of protecting them both, even if it meant hurting their hearts. Years later, Isabella was sitting at a cafe drinking her coffee and watching the world around her. Although her life had progressed, the memories of her time spent with Samuel continued to linger. They were bittersweet and treasured, and she smiled softly. While she was doing so, she ran her finger around the lip of her cup. Her attention was drawn to a figure that she recognized from across the room. The echoes of their love served as a gentle reminder of what had been. Samuel and she looked at one another, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if no time had passed at all. He smiled at her and she smiled back, displaying a blend of warmth and wistfulness in his face. However, in that short moment, they both recognized that their love had left an indelible stamp on their souls, despite the fact that flight had left an indelible mark on their hearts. Her heart was swelling with a weird combination of excitement and melancholy, but neither of them approached.